Chapter 21. Daniel Dwyer 16, November 9th, 2052 AD. The President-elect of the United States of America was Bradley Thomas, the fresh-faced socialist Democrat with ideas that would cripple the wealthy in favor of the lowly, a regular Robin Hood, and a wolf in sheep's clothing. He'd beat the incumbent Republican within a small margin, small enough that the Republicans were already claiming fraud, inviting distrust of the system and of the man who would be the next president into the hearts and minds of their followers. Ana Hernandez threw a party to watch the election results come in. She had supported Brad Thomas since he was campaigning during the primary election, and had been a regular campaign contributor all the way up until the election, and she screamed in joy as the newscasters called the election, predicting that it would result in her candidate's favor. She was also one of only 3 who knew the true name of the Spirit, and she'd thanked him by name every night in her prayers and asked God to watch over Daniel Dwyer and keep him safe. But she had never told anyone else his name and was never even tempted to. In just 2 years, that would change. For in another part of the city, Nathaniel Reddington was screaming at his television. If Brad Thomas made good on his word, not only would he be retroactively taxed like crazy, but the value of Nathaniel's investments would also plummet, and he dreaded what the stock market report was going to reveal the following morning simply due to his having won the election. Nathaniel had become exceedingly wealthy and had taken up more than a passing interest in politics, especially after experiencing firsthand how one person's voice can change the value of commodities overnight. One of his heaviest investments had been in the development and production of synthetic rice that could be cultivated without the obscene level of greenhouse gas emissions that was currently contributing to climate change by the release of methane as a byproduct of the current agricultural process. It seemed favorable. The world was up in arms about the state of the climate at the time, had been for decades, but then a spotlight was shone upon the gastrointestinal problems that long-term consumption of the synthetic food caused. This was swept under the table with the proper flow of cash as silence was bought and sold until a certain politician discovered it and decided to crusade against the production and sale of the injurious food and pushed investors toward alternative methods of rice production, those in which he and his contributors had interests and investments. It didn't break him, though, as Nathaniel in reality had an obscene amount of money, but it taught him to pay attention to politics and to fear the power of influence that politicians have over the flow of money and value of commodities, and he feared that the result of this election would not bode well for him. He yelled obscenities and angrily pointed his finger at his TV, and unexpectedly the Spirit appeared in his room and punched a hole through his wall-mounted flat-screen TV with the glowing red ball at the end of his right wrist, putting a large hole in the TV and the wall behind it, as if it had been hit by a catapult or a cannon. Then the Spirit looked into his right red hand and disappeared. The ball was always the last part of him to fade away. Nathaniel had studied footage of him in slow motion from several angles over the years as he disappeared into thin air, and discovered that when sufficiently slowed down, it appeared that the Spirit receded into the ball on the end of his hand when it faded away. It just happened so quickly that it couldn't be discerned with the naked eye. This was contrary to what happened when he first appeared, as he did not seem to form when he materialized so much as to appear fully intact instantaneously. "Don't worry," Nathaniel said aloud in his suddenly very quiet, empty estate. "He'll get what's coming to him, the fucking thief." It was the middle of the night, and Daniel was asleep in his bed. The majority of the time sightings of the Spirit were reported to occur at night, during his designated sleeping hours. Unfortunately, there was no way of associating specific nighttime events with distinctive incidents of spontaneous sleeping during the nighttime, as one could observe during the day because of the lack of intermittency. His designated sleep period was consistently uninterrupted, so it was impossible to corroborate the nocturnal activity of the Spirit with Daniel in the way that one could so easily intuit and translate diurnal activity of one with the other. At this point, it didn't matter anymore anyway. Without question, Daniel Dwyer was the Spirit. There was enough evidence to support it in the doctor's record-keeping, enough that he would be positively identified as a suspect in the assassination before being arrested for the murder of President Bradley Thomas within days of the assassination. Daniel was fit as a fiddle and strong as an ox, and yet had less than 3 years to live. He was a pawn in a game, the bullet, not the gun, and the poor simpleton would eventually get caught in the crossfire and die trying to escape the madness. Hannah and Dr. Foster were also watching the news late into the night, awaiting the projected results of the vote. When it was announced that the newcomer was the probable president-elect, they saluted one another, the doctor with his shot of whiskey, Hannah with her glass of water, and drank to celebrate his unlikely victory. "Finally, someone who is going to do something to help everyone," the doctor said, more than a little buzzed from the night of drinking. "We will see," Hannah said. "We will see if he can deliver what he promises. There are a lot of corporations that will stand in his way, companies with members of Congress and senators who rely on their campaign contributions to continuously be re-elected. He still needs the cooperation of those who oppose him, those who are paid to vote against him in order to get anything accomplished. And it won't be easy to convince some of these politicians that if they can get re-elected based on the merits of their actions in the voting booth, they won't have to satisfy corporations who are looking out only for their own financial interests. After all, there is no need for a corporation that is not guilty of some crime or another to lobby the favor of lawmakers. Any corporation that financially supports a politician is, in doing so, demonstrating admission of guilt and revealing that they have something to hide, something to gain by influencing what is and is not inducted into the law. Well, I tell you to write your congressman, but you're supposed to be dead, so," he grunted as he rose from his seat. "Instead, I'll just say good night, Hannah." "Good night, Hannah." "Good night, Patrick," she said. And she stayed and watched the news a while longer after the doctor made his way down the hall and went to bed. The future president broadcast a speech thanking those that voted for him and promised again, as he had so often during his campaign for the presidency, a better, brighter, safer, and cleaner future for the United States. He promised to instate free health care and medicine for all. He also promised that the wealthy would begin finally to pay their fair share of taxes, and that the disparity of wealth between the people would begin to equalize, as fair trade deals using clean energy sources produced on U.S. soil would necessitate the generation of jobs, and an increase in tax breaks to the lower and middle class would result because the federal government itself would invest in these clean energy sources on behalf of the people, essentially naming every U.S. citizen as an investor with shares divided in inverse proportion to their income, and funnel profits generated from use of energy into the pockets of those responsible for creating its flow from the bottom up, incentivizing the public to shift toward the use of the clean energy sources and subverting the poverty crisis in one fell swoop. Not only was this policy projected to drive the fossil fuel industry into ruin, all but eliminating harmful emissions from machinery, it would also support the economy in a way never conceived of before. The end result of his plan would be government control of the country's energy resources and healthcare system, regulating the pharmaceutical industry in the process, and taking the monopolization of power and profit over that which affected the well-being of the people regarding their healthcare and energy needs off the table for the greedy profiteer, but in doing so, empowering the government in such a way that was unprecedented in a free country. Naturally, the corruption that once engulfed the powers of old would only shift from one place to another, following the money wherever it went like hounds after blood. Where money flows, war follows, and if Daniel had not stepped in to tear down the world's governments when he did, the exploitation of this radical system by the greedy and manipulative underlying powers of the world would have eventually led to the fall of the Union altogether and the destabilization of the world economy, and the world would have erupted into war. Billions would have died, and all because of greed. Balance always persists. There is no great good bereft of terrible consequences, and no great evil that does not provoke a greater good. No end to any fight that does not result in the eventual destruction of both opponents. No help that is not in some way harmful. It seems that even seemingly self-aware complex bodies of animate mass, known to assert that they have free will, still dance to the refrain first heard by matter and antimatter, as since the beginning of time, it seems bodies form in the universe destined only to annihilate each other. It seems that the components of the universe yearn to return to their energetic states, so much so that the universe may have formed life in order to more quickly facilitate the transition from matter to energy in places where little energy would be produced otherwise. For life cannot live without death. Production precedes and follows annihilation. Such is the pattern for all of existence everywhere. The universe is slowly and deliberately committing suicide, returning to its energetic origins, and tearing itself apart using every resource at its disposal, life included. It would seem that the concept of complex matter had been rejected, and it was now being eliminated. Given trillions upon trillions of years, there would have been no intact atoms left in the universe, and only subatomic particles adrift in space-time straddling the quantum realm would remain. Dark energy would eventually have overtaken the nuclear bonds of atoms as it continued to drive the expansion of the universe, and nothing would have remained in the end except for the cold energy of the individual components of the former universe. Of course, this process is arrested and accelerated when Alexander activates his machine a little over 900 million years after the time of man, bringing the evolution of time to its inevitable conclusion, and all matter is converted into energy and then compressed, free from the effects of time, into an infinitesimally small area, awaiting the reintroduction of space-time, and the process is then forced to start anew, only to repeat again and again. Alexander 18, May 3rd, 45,731 BC. Every Tuwalan knew that the best manga grew on Hopalaboa, and since every other continent was now under ice, Lylin thought that she would never get the chance to try it. Over the years, they'd had to settle for the lower quality strains of manga weed native to Pafa-Odoa, but Hemhut had a surprise for her that morning. He'd managed to cultivate a plant that he discovered was secretly being grown in Pafa-Odoa that was a hybrid of a highly sought-after Hopalaboan strain of manga. It had taken decades to grow properly, and it was finally mature enough to start budding. He was anxious to see her reaction. He knew that today would be a good day, the first they'd had together in a long time, and the first of many to come. Fate scampered down the long hall of the palace and into Lylin's room, the rising sun glinting off the golden floor. She was depressed, and not even the little Babbitt was capable of lifting her spirits anymore. Fate climbed up the sheets and came whimpering hesitantly up to her face and smelled her still closed eyes. She brushed him away, feeling his whiskers as they tickled her nose and eyelashes. She opened her eyes and looked sternly at the little kitten that hadn't aged a day in all the time that she'd known him, in over 13 years, and Fate growled and bit her blanket and clawed at her bedding. "Leave me alone, Fate," Lylin said. Then she folded her ears down as she rolled over to face the other way. "I don't want to get up." Fate had not sat and whined and then walked in a little circle before lying down on the bed next to her, not touching her, but near enough to feel the warmth from off of her back. Lylin just wanted to go back to sleep. She didn't feel sad anymore. She didn't feel anything anymore. She just wanted to sleep until she was dead, just to get her life over with and be done with it. Nothing made her happy anymore, and she hardly ever spoke to Hemhut at all. He was always trying to provoke her into conversation, remarking about some hidden process intrinsic to the mundane which made a drop of water or a lump of clay sound like a universe unto itself, but he seldom got more than a disinterested shoulder from her in response anymore. She'd grown tired of her life, tired of everything, but today would mark the beginning of her revival. The smell of the weed wafted into her bedroom and she sat up, nose twitching in the air, ears straight up, and she scooted to the edge of the bed. Fate came up to her and twirled and mewed, and Lylin looked down at the Babbitt cat with a surprised look that turned into a hint of a smile as she asked the ball of fur, "Is that what I think it is?" Then she got out of bed, and still barefoot and in her nightgown, with Fate leading the way, made her way hurriedly down the hall. She stopped at the massive entryway and looked at Hemhut as Fate ran up to him and jumped into his lap. He sat on a little hill with his back turned to her, a cloud of smoke around him, and she watched him exhale more smoke as she came up behind him. "Hemhut," she said. "Yes, my love," Hemhut said. "Is that the Bowen manga weed?" she asked. "Yes, my love," he said. "Come, try it." She took the joint from him and looked up at him with a hint of that youthful smile that used to simply be her face, and asked, "Where did you get it?" "I found an imported hybrid that was being illegally grown here a long time ago, and I nurtured it into maturity. It took a long time, but it's finally ready for pruning, and it's really good," he said. "Try it." Her smile grew even bigger, and she took a hit from the joint and held it in before exhaling a large amount of smoke. She immediately started coughing and choking, and her eyes teared up, and it was several minutes before she got a hold of herself, and then, much to Hemhut's amusement, she said, "Tahoa, Hemhut, that's it for me. Whoa, that got me." And she almost lost her balance before Hemhut gently wrapped a hand around her. Then she started to laugh. "Are you hungry, my love?" he asked her. "Starving, yes," she said, then excitedly, "Yes, I want fish for breakfast today." She gestured for him to pick her up, and she sat on his shoulder and leaned on his head. "You might have to catch one for me, though. I don't know if I—" And then her arm slipped, and she almost fell off of her perch. But Hemhut caught her in a flash, and then held her in his folded arms. She looked up at him, thrilled from the adrenaline rush of having fallen and been so gently caught, and she smiled and laughed and said, "You knew that was going to happen, and you let it happen. I see your game. You're going to have to do more than that to impress me, Mr. I Know Everything. You can only catch me if you let me fall in the first place, and don't think I don't know it." She was teasing him, provoking him into conversation. So long as he chose his words, his arguments, and mannerisms carefully, he could pull her out of her depression. As long as the momentum established in this moment could be sustained, he could have her back before the end. For, though she looked to be in her mid-30s, she was not long for death, old and frail in reality, and if he didn't get her back soon, there would be no chance of ever doing so again while she lived. It made him so happy to see her smile that he involuntarily brightened the sky as he smiled back at her. "Not all things happen for a reason, as reason implies intelligent design, but everything serves a purpose," he said. "Oh? And what exactly was the purpose in letting me fall off of your shoulder just to catch me?" she asked, gazing up at him. "It made you laugh," he said, "and I'd rather hear one more laugh from you than one less where I can help it. I know we tend to overthink things, but some things are just that simple. I just wanted to hear you laugh." "I'm sorry, Hemhut," she said, looking away in sullen contemplation for a moment before looking back with a big smile on her face. "Sorry that you're not funny. Maybe if you were funny I would laugh more. Instead you're always, 'I'm Hemhut. Let me tell you about dirt. It's so amazing.'" She made a grim face and spoke in a low voice as she imitated him, and he laughed and she laughed. "Actually," she said, feeling more and more youthful by the moment, "I want to get my own fish. Put me down." She ran the rest of the way to the water, but instead of stopping to fetch for a fish, she jumped into the pond with her nightgown still on. The fish scattered, but she felt like doing something spontaneous and unexpected, and was hungrier more for life than for any food at that moment. She was beginning to see herself, and was actively trying to pull herself from her own misery by simply trying to actively alter her perspective. Her world was going to be the same tomorrow as it had been yesterday, but how she lived in it was up to her. She was breaking the mold, trying to be happy instead of wallowing in sadness. She had actually fractured one of her ankles while running, but Hemhut kept her from feeling the pain and healed her before she even noticed that she was injured, allowing nothing to ruin her potentially fleeting happiness, letting nothing steal it away that it might never again return. He came to the water's edge and looked down at her. Her smile was big, her eyes bloodshot, and she spit out a mouthful of water like a fountain and reached both hands up to him as he approached and said, "Come on, come swim with me. The water's perfect." The water was always perfect. It would not be long before Hemhut would be alone, his love having gone on to another place. He knew it, and it seemed that as she unknowingly approached the end of her days, ignorant of her true age, and became happier, he became sad, as in all things there is balance. In reality, the Hopalaboan manga had been ready for a few years, but he foresaw that he had to wait until today to share it with her, or she would die sad and alone while in his arms. If he'd given it to her any earlier, it would have been wasted, and her state of glumness would have only temporarily been averted to later return with a vengeance. He became sad as she became happy, because it seemed as though it was a steeper fall for her to her death. It felt as though the happier she was, the more she valued her life. Thus, to die sad is to end misery, while to die happy is to bring misery. For ever in balance as are all things. He joined her in the water, and she dunked her head under, again taking in another gulp and spitting it out like a fountain as she swam toward him playfully. She folded her ears down, ducked under the ripples, and came toward him under the water, swam clumsily up to Hemhut, and emerged in front of him, planting a kiss on his cheek after bursting from the water. They had a good morning, a good day. They laughed and talked and played with fate, and the food tasted better to her, and the sunlight felt warmer, and she began to have that little hint of a smile on her face all the time, the way she'd had in her youth, like she was always thinking of something pleasant and was forever on the verge of laughter. That night they sat and watched the sunset the way that they used to, Lilan laying on top of Hemhut, the two of them watching the sky. Then something occurred to her. She took a puff from a joint of the Leboan Munga and passed it up to Hemhut. Then she said, "Hemhut, if you don't need to breathe and probably have no respiratory or circulatory systems, then how is it that you can be affected by the Munga? Wouldn't it be just like how you don't eat? Wait, you do get affected by Munga, don't you?" She rolled over and scooted up to look him in the eye, just like she'd done so many times in years past, and he exhaled a cloud of smoke and offered the joint back to her with a gesture. She shook her head, and he put it out and set it down on a rock. "Well," he said, "I believe it affects me, and therefore it does. I don't know if the effect is genuinely in response to the chemical compound in the Munga smoke, or if it is a psychosomatic response from my mind. In either case, both start with how the mind responds to smoking it." "What's a psychosomatic response?" she asked, struggling to pronounce the new word carefully in her stoned state. "It is what is commonly called the placebo effect. You see, anyone can turn water into wine or tobacco into weed. All you need is confidence in the minds of those to whom it is presented that a certain response will be elicited, and their minds will do the rest," he said. "What are you talking about?" she said suspiciously. "Are you telling me that you could give me water and tell me that it's wine, and if I believe it, what, I would feel drunk?" "That is precisely what I'm saying, my love," he said. "The power of the mind to react to a substance can be just as powerful as a genuine reaction to a substance with real mind-altering capabilities. If you truly believe that consumption of any substance will have a certain effect, your mind will contribute to the sensation of experiencing that effect automatically. It has been proven time and time again. If you give an inexperienced person something to consume and tell them that they are expected to react in a certain way, oftentimes their reaction will conform to the preconceived notion that they have regarding the substance, and on a subconscious level, their experience attempts to match their expectation. The same substance can be given to different people, a substance that does nothing at all, a pill made of sugar or gelatin or water, a so-called placebo, something with no expected response associated with it on a chemical level, and in many cases, the experience of the person consuming the harmless non-toxic substance will conform to the preconception suggested to them and insist that they feel the expected effects. This demonstrates the power of suggestion both from external and internal sources to control one's experiences in life. Perception comprises a great deal of reality, maybe even all of it, Lilan. She thought about it for a second and then said, "Wait, Hemhut? Did you just give me fake weed?" "No, my love," he laughed. "You have smoked enough Munga in your life to tell the difference. It would take a great deal of faith for you to fool yourself into a psychosomatic response to a substance intended to imitate a reaction that with which you are so familiar. It is not outside the realm of possibility, but it is highly unlikely. It would be much more likely for you to smoke fake weed and complain that you don't feel the response you expected. The placebo effect is most prevalent when there are no prior associations with the substance in question on the part of the one being given the placebo." "So what?" she said. "If you gave me something to drink and told me that my toes would fall off, my toes would not fall off because that's a physical process. But if you told me that it would make me tired, I would get sleepy because I can subconsciously control chemical responses in my own brain? Is that what you're saying? So, because you have never smoked Leboan Munga before, your mind simulates the effects of it based on the experience of other Tawalans?" "Precisely, my love," he said. "The thinking mind is the most powerfully deceptive thing in the universe. It decides what is real and what is not, regardless of what is or isn't real. Like I've said before, existence is not just improbable, it is impossible, and it may be that it is only rendered so because of the limits of our understanding. If it is real, if we take for granted that it is real, then it must be possible. So, the real question, the relevant question, is not whether or not existence is possible, which it probably isn't, but whether or not reality is real. Because even if we accept on faith that the universe is real, that existence is real, it doesn't guarantee that our means of perceiving it doesn't give us misleading information. Our senses fabricate reality from sensory information carried in waves and particles, information that can easily be altered and misinterpreted and reinterpreted. Because when things don't make sense to a thinking mind, the thinking mind makes sense of them. On some level, our own prejudices shape the universe into what we expect it to be. And Lylon? Yeah, she said. I'm really high right now. He smiled and leaned back as she laughed hysterically and beat on his chest with her little fist. Where's Fate? She sat up and called for the little fuzzball in a sing-song voice. Fate! Moments later, he came running around the bend of a hill with a yelp and sprinted up to her. They were happy, and that night Lylon went to sleep with a smile on her face for the first time in years. And she did not cry herself to sleep as she had done so often as of late, and she woke happily the next day, again to the pungent smell of labo and manga in the air. And she looked forward to doing it all again, and she looked even younger than the day before. He would have to let her go soon, but he enjoyed their remaining years together, and thankfully so did she. He kept his love from knowing the pain of growing old just as he kept her from knowing pain of any other kind. But her aged body was in truth deteriorating. He could not keep her alive for much longer. Soon, he would be alone.